All right. This is our 74th lesson. We'll have one more lesson, and I might have a catch-all lesson a little bit later, but some new information I've come up with just recently. We could have two more lessons, but the third one will be a shorter lesson. But we're just about through with the material. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the testing of the Fox flood model with the scientific method. So we introduced the scientific method and how we test things in our last lesson, but we'll be looking at it, my model, testing it here tonight. And next week, Lord willing, we'll be doing that again with the last lesson. Now, I have an abbreviation. FFM is Fox flood model. Just kind of make this shorter with not having to write too much on the screen. AAOECGM, that's a big abbreviation. It's an acronym, I guess you could call it. I've taught for the FAA for years, and they don't use any acronyms in the government at all. Okay, I'm being facetious. It's acronym. Every time you turn around, there's an acronym. But this is an acronym. I'll be using it tonight. AAOECGM, and that'll be atheists, agnostics, old Earth creationists, geologic model. Atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist, geologic model. That's what that is. So I've laid it out here: creationist, old Earth creationist. So old Earth creationists go along with the atheist and agnostic on how they interpret things, pretty much, right? They'll say God governed it or guided it, but it happened the way the geologists tell them. We're going to be looking at some rules and logic and be sure that we don't draw any wrong conclusions from the information we get here. We'll be sure we don't do that. So let's look at that. If the Fox flood model is sound, there should be a number of phenomena that should be evident both in geology and in astronomy. So that's my claim. If it's sound, it should be some phenomena that should be evident that the Fox flood model agrees with or predicts. We're going to test the hypothesis that the Fox flood model is sound in this section. The first premise will be of this form. If the Fox flood model, and I'll just abbreviate it from now, the FFM, is sound, in X, something X should have occurred. And if we're going to be scientific, it should be a testable, so something we can observe, an observable phenomena. The second premise is the Fox flood model, FFM, is sound. Then we'll say conclusion, X should have occurred. Now, this is not proving it. Keep this in mind. The model predicts this, and you disprove the model by showing it predicts something that doesn't occur. That's how science works. It always works negative. And we've seen why it does that, and we'll lay this out again, because this is very important we understand this. X will be an observable consequence. That's the term that will be used, right? In this instance, the expression observable consequence refers to both historically observable, and we're going to say something that we can observe historically, because we can't go back and look at it and observe it actually happening. So we have to look at evidence that it occurred. For instance, the highway patrol might come out to an auto accident and look at skid marks and other things and get information about how fast the car was driving or something else. And they might say that this car crossed the center line because the skid marks show it. And we could see other information. They would look at the cars and how they're damaged, and they could tell information about that. So they can predict things from other things that they know. So what we're looking at here, an observable concept, we're going to look at things like fossils, sedimentary rocks, craters, and so forth. and through present day evidence. So we're going to look at the historically observable through fossils and sedimentary rocks and mountains and other things of that nature, and through present day evidence. Because proving the consequent does not prove the antecedent to be true. It's a logical fallacy to affirm the consequent, and we must frame the argument in a negative form. We'll go back to look at the argument. If I say, if the Fox flood model is sound, then X should have occurred. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. Then I say it's sound, therefore X occurred. Now, what have I proven? If I come in and say X occurred, I didn't prove that the Fox flood model is sound. That's clear. You got to understand that. So what we can do is, and what we have to do is, we have to disprove this conclusion, X should have occurred. If the Fox flood model is sound, then something should occur. If that thing does not occur, then that disproves my model. And that's how science works. Is that clear to everybody? So otherwise, we're committing a logical fallacy of denying the consequent. And we're going to employ modus tollens, and we're going to start a logic class in January, so you'll see what that means. You deny the consequent, and you can disprove the antecedent. And so you contradict the antecedent. Here's the form of argument that's required right here. If the Fox flood model, FFM, is sound, then X should have occurred. X has not occurred, right? Fox flood model is not sound, and that is wrong. It should be is not sound. It's a mistake in this chart. Is not sound. Oh, it's unsound. That's what I had here. I was reading it wrong. I'm sorry. It's unsound. Can you still see it? Fellas, can you still see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. It's unsound. It's not sound. Let me illustrate this. If I killed Abraham Lincoln, then I was alive when Abraham Lincoln was alive. Is that true? Everyone agree with that?
Yes, sir.
And if you disprove that I was alive, you can show that I wasn't alive when Abraham Lincoln was murdered, then you can prove that I did not kill him. And so since I wasn't alive whenever he was murdered, I cannot be accused of having murdered him, not successfully in a fair court. They couldn't accuse me and convict me of it in a court that was fair. So again, if Marion Fox murdered Abraham Lincoln, then Marion Fox was alive when he was murdered. That's good. That's the first premise. Marion Fox was not alive when he was murdered. That's true. Therefore, Marion Fox did not murder Abraham Lincoln. And so that's when you're denying the consequence, see? And that disproves the antecedent, right? So if my model predicts something should be true by my model, then if you disprove what my model says should happen, then you've destroyed my model. You've shown it to be false. That's exactly how science works. They take a hypothesis and then they try to disprove it over and over by testing. And each time they fail to disprove it, they show a stronger probability that it's right. But they never absolutely prove it to be true with science. That's the way it works. He repeatedly attempts to falsify his hypothesis if he's truly following scientific method. Each time he fails to falsify his hypothesis, he gets greater credibility to the hypothesis. Every time he tests it, and it always keeps coming out the same and right, he says, this is probably correct. Right? Note that he never conclusively proves his hypothesis by this method, but he shows the likelihood that it's true. Atheists, agnostics, and old Earth creationists have the age of the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old. Now, notice I listed this as 4,500 million years for a reason. A lot of people in other countries, the word billion is a million million. In the United States, it's 1,000 million. So I've made that distinction here, and be aware of that. And you can Google that and see that what I'm saying is true. So they use what we call a trillion is what they call a billion in Europe. The Fox flood model has the universe, including the Earth, to be less than 10,000 years old. Judson, pages 371 through 372, and we've already looked at Judson in our book, and so it's in this chapter, claims the present erosion rate would reduce the continents to sea level less than 34 million years. And Kennedy, pages 497 to 498, claims that the present erosion rate would reduce the continents to sea level in less than 25 million years. So the two of them together, approximately 30 million years, all the continents should be down to sea level from erosion, just by the material that's carried by rivers into the oceans. That should have happened, according to two different sources. Now, they don't have exactly the same number, but they're pretty close to the same. They're what scientists would call one order of magnitude. An order of magnitude is 10 to 1. And two orders of magnitude is 100 to 1, 100 to 1 times. Now, if the Fox flood model regarding the age of the Earth is unsound, then the continents should have eroded to sea level. Continents have not eroded to sea level. I'm denying that. And so the Fox flood model regarding the Earth is not unsound. It is not disproven. See, the double negation makes an affirmative. So we have not disproven my model by the age of the Earth. All right? So keep that in mind. Now then, my model says it should be young. It should not be extremely old, billions of years old. And so we find here, since the continents have not eroded to sea level, not even near it, it can't be 25 or 30 million years old. It has to be much younger than that. We're going to test the atheistic, agnostic, old Earth creationist AAOEGM model, geologic model. If this model regarding the age of the Earth is sound, the atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model, it should have a C in there, then the continents should have eroded to sea level. Why? Because they deem that it's 4.5 billion years old, the Earth is. The continents have not eroded to sea level, therefore, their model is not what? Not sound. So their model has been disproven. Now then, do not interpret this to mean that all atheistic models have been disproven. All that's been disproven is this one model, but most of the atheistic models depend upon an old Earth. So the atheistic models that depend upon an old Earth have a problem here, a major problem. Because the continents have not eroded to sea level, they can't be more than 25 million years old. And that's the upper age. And they're not even near eroded to sea level. So they're much less than 25 million years old, not 4 billion years, but less than 25 million. And when I say less, I don't mean 24 million, because they would be eroded almost to sea level at 24 million. There'd be much of a continent left. So right here, we have a problem for the old Earth creationists and agnostic and atheists. Those people have a problem here interpreting what we see out there in the real world. Now they have to attack these dates that are set, that we've already set forth here. But the problem is they know how much sediment's going down the rivers. They can measure it. And so they can just project backwards from that sediment as how much material there is in the continent. And it's pretty good information. And so what we have here is The atheist has a serious problem. His model that assumes an old Earth is disproven. And so any model that has an old Earth necessary condition has been disproven by this, that unless that old Earth would be maybe 10 million years or 5 million years. But up in the order of a billion years, it's definitely been disproven, or a billion or more. Now, the Fox flood model must have coal and petroleum to be formed in short periods of time because they're here, they exist. And so they got formed. And if we believe the Earth is young, then there has to be evidence, or at least we have to, in order to know the Earth is young, we have to say we can prove the coal and petroleum were formed or could have been formed in short periods of time. But Nietzsche claims that both coal and petroleum can be formed in a few years. There's some experiments that we cited. We cited this earlier in our study. Larson, page 316, claims that coal can be formed in short periods of time. So we have both coal and petroleum. And coal, Larson is dealing with coal, Nietzsche is dealing with both of them. Now, if the Fox flood model regarding the age of the Earth is sound, then it should be possible for both coal and petroleum to be formed in short periods of time. Now, we've proven two different sources, and there are other sources we could have quoted. If you go to the sources I cited, they'll cite some additional sources. But it's possible for both coal and petroleum to be formed in short periods of time, just in a year or two, sometimes even a few months. The Fox flood model is not unsound. It has not been falsified. It has not been disproven. Now then, that doesn't prove it's true. It just says we have a disproven model. I disproved the atheistic model, the old Earth, several billion years, with an argument just earlier. But we're looking at my model now. Did we disprove it? And the answer is no. We have shown that it's possible to form coal and petroleum in short periods of time. If it took millions of years to form it, then the young Earth view that I take would be disproven. If it took that long to form it. Now, then just the fact that I couldn't prove that the coal and petroleum could be formed in short periods, my model would be in question. I haven't proven it, haven't shown it. But if they could prove that it could not be formed, and they have to prove a negative, that's pretty hard to do sometimes. But if they could prove it could not be formed, then they could disprove my premise, my hypothesis. We need to test the atheistic, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model and look at it here. If either coal or petroleum or both require millions of years to form, then it's necessary for the Earth to be millions of years old. That's the claim that's made. One of the arguments that's been made in the past is it took that long for coal and petroleum to be formed. Therefore, you're wrong about the age of the Earth. But modern research has shown that they can form it in short periods of time. Either coal or petroleum or both require millions of years to form. That's the atheist argument. It used to be one of their big arguments. Conclusion, it's necessary for the Earth to be millions of years old. This argument may have swayed some people to adopt the old Earth view because they said the coal and petroleum just took too long. But what their problem was is they're arguing from ignorance. The fact that I can't prove that it could be formed in shorter periods of time doesn't mean it couldn't be. And so people 50 years ago or 100 years ago couldn't prove it. But now they've proven it in labs. They've actually produced coal or petroleum, and they can't tell the difference in it. And the regular coal we mine and the petroleum we pump out of the ground. Can't tell any difference in it. If we test the atheistic, the agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model, we ask this question: if either coal or petroleum or both require millions of years to form, then it's necessary for the Earth to be millions of years old. That's their claim. Used to be an argument they made. Either coal or petroleum or both require millions of years to form, It's necessary for the Earth to be millions of years old. Now, that's basically what they were arguing. In order to test this, we need to deny the antecedent. Therefore, we'll apply what's called transposition or contraposition to the argument to test it. What you do is, if you say if P then Q, you reverse it and say if not Q then not P. You switch places and negate both of them. That's all you do with contraposition. Jesus employed contraposition in a couple of instances in the New Testament in his argumentation. And when we take the logic class next semester, I'll be showing that he actually used this principle. It's called modus tollens is a basic argument after contraposition. From contraposition and De Morgan's theorem, our argument becomes, here's what it becomes. If it's not necessary for the Earth to be millions of years old, then neither coal nor petroleum nor both require millions of years to form. Now that we can say. And so I would argue then that neither coal nor petroleum require millions of years to form. That's your second premise. All right. So it's not necessary. Okay. So right here, it's not necessary for the Earth to be billions of years old. Okay. Let's move on. The Fox flood model has the antediluvian Earth, that's the pre-flood world, to have an increased barometric pressure, about 3 times the present atmosphere, and an increased oxygen content in the atmosphere, about 35% compared with the present, 21%. This has a lot of implications, and the antediluvian world was shielded from harmful radiation by this atmosphere. And so radiocarbon, 6 carbon 14, it was shielded from by this, what I would call a canopy of water vapor. Radiocarbon would not be formed, and UV light, which damages us and gives some people to get enough of it, you get skin cancer. X-rays would be blocked by it. Cosmic rays would be blocked by it, both cosmic rays that are galactic as well as those that are in the solar system, cosmic rays, by this water vapor canopy. Okay. Now, here's the first premise. If the Fox flood model is sound, then Earth's antediluvian atmosphere had a greater barometric pressure and a greater oxygen content. Now, my model is sound, I'm claiming, and the antediluvian atmosphere had a greater barometric pressure or a greater oxygen content. Now, this is true. We showed this from scientific information in our earlier study, that the barometric pressure, there's evidence from materials and things we have that it was higher barometric pressure and a greater oxygen content. Both of these were proven to have existed at some time in the past. And so what we have here then is the conclusion here, consequent, after the words after then, let me do that again. Then, the words after then up here, that is true. Now, you can't affirm the consequent and prove the antecedent. Now, that's a fallacy. But in order to check this, we need to deny the antecedent or disprove the consequent, rather, disprove the consequent. So we need to, when they need to prove that the antediluvian atmosphere did not have a greater barometric pressure or a greater oxygen content. That's how they could disprove my argument. But we've already proven that it had, at some time in the past, it had a greater barometric pressure and a greater oxygen content. That's already been proven. So now here's what we can do. The hypothesis is not falsified, it's given credibility when we see this evidence that we've had. My model, the Fox flood model, has the antediluvian Earth's magnetic. If we go back to this now, This hypothesis can be checked or tested. How can it be tested? They can test this hypothesis with hyperbaric chambers. So my hypothesis is testable, or it can be examined or checked. And if they would take hyperbaric chambers and experiment with different pressures and with different oxygen content levels, too much oxygen becomes toxic. But my hypothesis is that oxygen content of around between 30 and 35%, probably close to 35%, and the barometric pressure of maybe 2.5 to 3 times the present barometric pressure, that would be optimum for an organism to live in. They could check that with hyperbaric chambers, and so there could be an experiment to check that. In fact, the motivation for that would be if they put people who are quite ill into a hyperbaric chamber under those conditions, they could leave them. Right now, the hyperbaric chambers have about 2.5 or 3 times the barometric pressure, but they run 100% oxygen because when they decompress them, they get the bends, like a diver gets when he comes up too fast out of the water. And what we get here is they wouldn't get this as rather they could leave them in that condition in that hyperbaric chamber for several days at a time if they're really quite ill. Whereas they can't leave them in now because they're running 100% oxygen, it becomes toxic, they'll kill them. So they could actually experiment with it and check it. This hypothesis can be checked. And so this would be a way to test my hypothesis. The Fox flood model has the antediluvian Earth's magnetic field to be more intensive, shielding the Earth from cosmic rays better than it does now. Well, the atheist agrees the magnetic field is decreasing. So that's been verified. Since cosmic rays are one source of mutations, there would be fewer mutations to occur. Now that's pretty well easily verifiable as well. It also explains the apparent rapid changes in direction of the Earth's magnetic field as evidence for remote magnetism. They've taken lava that was magnetized, and then the lava then solidified, and it stayed in one location. What they found in this, and Coe and Privant and Lewin, and I've cited these earlier, the magnetic field moved in just a day or two from one moved by 30 or 40 degrees in direction in this lava. And this would fit in quite well with the flood model that I've given. Okay, so the Fox flood model has this very, very quickly, and it could happen during the flood. Could have happened easily during the flood. Okay, we've shown that with some of our graphs and the charts. The Fox flood model has the antediluvian soil to be near optimum fertility. We can check that. If the Fox flood model regarding the formation of the Earth is sound, then the antediluvian soil should be near optimum fertility. And I'm claiming it's sound. Therefore, the antediluvian soil should be near optimum fertility. If we could go back to check the model to look at it, the antediluvian soil, if we could look at it and find some and check it, and it's not near optimum fertility, that would, if we determined indeed that it was antediluvian soil, then that would disprove my model. So I'm saying that this is verifiable too. Becomes part of that premise of the next argument. If the antediluvian soil is near optimum fertility, and soil that is under the Greenland ice cap should be near optimum fertility. If this soil was covered by ice and never was eroded through the flood, then that soil should be very or extremely fertile. And that's what I'm claiming. The antediluvian soil is near optimum. So the soil under the Greenland ice cap should be near optimum fertility. That's my claim. That's something that can be checked. It's one of my hypotheses that can be tested and should be tested. The Fox flood model explains mountain building processes. If the Fox flood model is sound, then the planet that God used to cause the flood could raise the mountains by gravity. So, and I'm claiming the model is sound and it could cause the flood to raise mountains by gravity. Now, the question is gravity sufficient to uplift the mountains? And we showed from the calculations that it is. A planet could come close enough to actually raise the mountain ranges. The atheist, of course, that is sufficient explanation for the orogenesis. That's the beginning of mountains, how mountains are raised. The old Earth atheist, agnostic, old Earth creationist geologic model has no plausible explanation for orogenesis, how mountains were formed. This is admitted by Wilson, page 445, Erdley, page 187, and Hapgood, page 193. They all admit it. They have no explanation for it. Now, their failure to be able to explain it doesn't mean my model is correct, but it does mean that they need to be modifying their model to explain it. This makes my model more reasonable than their model, because mine would explain it with simple physics, with the physics that you get in maybe undergraduate physics in a normal physics program. You would have that. Probably even just general physics, you'd have enough to get it. And so you can get the gravity, the force of gravity, the uplift forces. The Fox flood model explains furthermore, not only this, but it explains the retrograde rotation of Venus. If the Fox flood model is sound, then the planet that God used to cause the flood could cause Venus to rotate retrograde. I claim my model is sound, so we're going to check it. Could it cause it to Venus to rotate retrograde? We've already shown it in an earlier study that it could cause it to rotate in a retrograde manner. It's a sufficient condition to explain the retrograde rotation of Venus. What about the old atheist, agnostic, old Earth, uniformitarian solar system model? It should have all the planets either rotating in the same direction or in lockstep with the sun. That's called tidally locked. The moon is in lockstep, or it's in tidal lock with the Earth. It keeps the same face to the Earth at all times. And so that's tidal locking. The astronomers generally believe that their view of how the Earth and solar system was formed, all of the matter should be rotating in the same direction. And so what we see there is that's not happening. Venus is not rotating in the right direction. It's rotating retrograde, backwards. Something has happened, or it should be in lockstep or tidally locked, but the sun keeping the same face to the sun at all times. The first premise is the atheist, agnostic, old Earth, uniformitarian solar system model. If it's sound, then all the planets should either be rotating in the same direction or in lockstep with the sun, tidally locked. Some of the planets are not rotating in the same direction. Venus is rotating retrograde, backwards. Therefore, their model is not sound. So you can't take a uniformitarian model. There has to be something else to cause that retrograde rotation. And of course, they can't be strict uniformitarians. Give up strict uniformitarianism here. Now, what we get into is we go to the next one, and it's quick frozen animals and plants. And we see the animals were frozen very quickly. Now, our evidence that they were quick frozen is that their internal organs on big animals like mammoths or huge elephants, the internal organs hadn't decomposed. You have an animal that starts freezing, let's say it's 0 degrees outside. An elephant, it takes maybe a day or two for these internal organs to get frozen. And during that time, those organs will begin to decompose. So if the Fox flood model is sound, then the cosmic ice could quick freeze mammoths, suffocating them. These mammoths were suffocated. They died of suffocation. Keep that in mind. The evidence shows that. I'm claiming my model is sound, and therefore the cosmic ice could quick freeze mammoths. If it's cosmic ice, it would be, now the coldest you can get is about 450, 457 or somewhere thereabouts degrees below zero, 273 degrees below 0 Celsius, with some change on them, but 459 I think it was, Fahrenheit. So let's say about 450 degrees below zero, cosmic ice. That would suck the heat out of an animal right quick, that kind of cold, and it would suffocate them because it would liquefy the oxygen in the air. The air would turn into liquid. The oxygen would turn into liquid oxygen, and that would suffocate them. And these mammoths died, when they've done autopsies on them, they died of suffocation. They suffocated. And that's exactly what would happen if you had cosmic ice coming in and raining down through the sky. The Fox flood model proves a sufficient condition for quick frozen mammoths, even explaining how they died. Atheistic, agnostic, old Earth uniformitarian model neither has a mechanism for the extreme cold of quick frozen mammoths, nor can explain how they died. Can't explain it. My model explains it. Therefore, my model, the Fox flood model, is more reasonable than the agnostic, atheist, agnostic, old Earth uniformitarian model. More reasonable. The Fox flood model explains how ice sheets were formed. If my model is sound, then both the presence and locations of the ice sheets can be reasonably explained by cosmic ice. Remember, ice, there's ferromagnetic, paramagnetic, diamagnetic materials, 3 different kinds of magnetic materials. Ferromagnetic is attracted to a magnet at room temperature. Paramagnetic, when you get it cold enough, it can be magnetized. A diamagnetic is not magnetized at any temperature, but it is repelled by a magnet, at least faintly repelled, can be even strongly repelled. Water is diamagnetic. And so water in the form of ice would be deflected and moved by the magnetic field of the Earth, and that would funnel the ice in at the polar regions where the magnetic field is. And so both the presence and location of ice sheets can be reasonably explained by cosmic ice. And the word that's used in Amos is a word that implies that there were rings around the planet that was used, or the Orion, it's called. And it's called Orion. That's how it's translated. But actually what it means is a star with a ring around it. And Job mentions Orion as having rings. And so the term Orion is used for a constellation. That's what some people think it means, but I don't think it does. It's a planet with rings. The Hebrews did not distinguish between a planet and a star. It was a shining object. And this was a star with rings around it. And that was discussed in the book of Amos, as we've already looked at, in the context of discussing the flood. And so a planet was involved that had rings, and most of your planets with rings, the rings are ice with some rocks and dust and other material in them. Right? Both the presence and location of the ice sheets, the ice sheets are symmetrical about the magnetic field of the Earth, not the geographic poles. And the geographic and the magnetic poles aren't located in the same place. So your ice is symmetrical around the magnetic poles, not the geographic poles. You'd expect if it was weather oriented, it'd be around the geographic poles, not the magnetic. But it's around the magnetic poles. Let's look at the agnostic atheist old Earth geologic model regarding ice sheets. If that model is sound, then it has sufficient explanation for both the present locations of ice sheets. Does not have a sufficient explanation. Why? Because the locations are in the wrong spot. They should have been geographical about the geographic poles, but they're not. And they're in the wrong locations. Also, ice, cold ice, takes the moisture out of the air. In the wintertime, when cold weather, cold climates, the humidity is very low. Antarctica is the driest place in the whole world. It's drier than the Sahara Desert because the cold takes all of the moisture out of the air. You don't get much precipitation in an extremely cold climate. You cannot get the snow that you need to make glaciers when it gets real cold because it takes the moisture out of it. When it starts crossing the edge of the glacier, whatever moisture is in it will come out of it. But the center of the glacier, if it's a big glacier, you won't get anything in it. Now, a small glacier, you can get the snow because it will cross over it. But a big one, you won't get it. And the atheist doesn't have any way, and they've known this for over 120 years, that cold weather makes the air dry. And you can't produce a glacier with extremely cold weather. So the model is not sound. It puts it in the wrong locations, and it has no way of getting the snow there to make the glacier, to make the ice several miles thick, like we have it at the North and the South Pole, and Greenland and Antarctica. Reasons that extremely cold climates cannot produce glaciers were given in earlier chapters. We documented it from other sources, not just Marion Fox, but from reputable scientists. Now that concludes our lesson for tonight. Do you have any questions?
Not me.